everyone, welcome to Amanda's Book Corner. I'm your host, Amanda, and I'm honored to be interviewing Victoria Costello, the author of Orchid Child, which just came out a few days ago on June 13th. Victoria Costello is an award-winning writer and educator living in Ashland, Oregon. Her nonfiction work has appeared in various publications, including the Huffington Post, and her debut title, A Lethal Inheritance, A Mother Uncovers the Science Behind Three Generations of Mental Illness, was released in 2012 with Prometheus Books. Orchid Child is her first work of fiction. So welcome, Victoria. I'm so excited to be talking with you today.
So thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So for anyone listening who hasn't read it yet, can you describe what Orchid Child is about?
Well, how I usually describe it is that it's the story of the travails and few triumphs of three generations in an Irish-American family. But with a twist, which happens when the youngest member, a teenager who hears voices and talks to trees, but rarely people, confronts a century of suffering of his forebears by tapping his neurodiversity and the wisdom of his Celtic ancestors.
That's amazing. What was the inspiration behind Orchid Child?
Well, in many ways, it evolved from my memoir, which in fact was my telling of three generations of suffering, mental illness, war, famine, trauma on the part of my Irish ancestors going back a century. And, there are many things I could dig up in Ireland and here, but there were a lot of things that were just unknowable. And so that's when I allowed myself to ask, like, what if my grandparents, who were the immigrants in the early, the 1910s, what if they had to leave? That was the period of the build-up to the 1920 Irish Rebellion, and they were in the worst of the British brutality during the colonial oppression. And, they couldn't even have their own language, or, they couldn't, basically, they had no rights and couldn't own land and, had no control over their property. And so the rebellion, which had happened many times before in the previous 600 years, was really getting closer to them in Galway, which is where they came from. And so I was imagining it, what if there was a split in the community, and as there were in many, where you had to take sides, and some people were thinking, well, it'd be better if we just stay with the devil we know, which was the British, as opposed to going ahead with this rebellion and risking life and limb and everything, essentially. So I invented some things that could have happened, and one of them was that these two people, who are the grandparents of the main character you meet at the very beginning of the novel, Kate, that they were accused of being traitors to the Republican cause. And so they didn't want to leave, but they had to leave because there would have been retribution. So that was kind of the original trauma that I imagined. And so many things then flowed from that. The poverty of being, new immigrants in Depression era New York, and some of the violence that followed them across the Atlantic. So, for each generation that I portrayed, and I felt that to get at the kind of intergenerational trauma, which was kind of the heart of the story, it wasn't enough to have it sort of trickle down and be told by the two main characters who are seen in 2002, that we had to go back and see it through the eyes of, and in this case, I chose the grandmother, Ellen, to be the one who told us what that was like, to go across the Atlantic, know no one, start a new life, and never get home back to where she, felt was her home in West Ireland. So that's a long way of saying, kind of how I allowed myself to use my family history, but then depart from it. So, in that sense, Orchid Child is autofiction.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. You draw on so much history and science. And I mean, you mentioned your memoir. You've previously written a nonfiction book. What was it like switching to fiction for this?
Well, it was kind of liberating, because I had worked in documentary film, and then I became a science writer and an editor, and I worked for a research publisher. And my job there was to interpret new research for, regular lay readers. So scientists are extremely particular, and that's why it's so hard for lay people to understand what they're saying or writing. And so, having come from that, I felt like I was in a position to write a novel that included science, and it was a very new science. It still is new. Epigenetics and inherited trauma is just beginning to percolate into the culture.
Mm.
Uh, but to then have the liberty of creating situations and a historical plot that centers that, but is really digging into the personal individual experience of what it's like to live through that. So I'd say it was liberating in many ways.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's true. I mean, science can be hard for regular people to understand, and I'm no scientist myself, but I think you did a wonderful job of making it easy for regular people like me to understand it and really connect with it.
Yes, I noticed in your review that you really expressed excitement about learning about epigenetics. And I've actually been a little surprised. I've heard that from a number of readers. You never know when you put out these things. So that's very gratifying that people, get a taste of it and then they want to know more. Same goes for the history.
Yeah.
You never know how much is too much, but you have to lay the groundwork for why these people are making these drastic, not always great decisions.
Mhm.
uh, but so I was really pleased to be able to dig into that area, because it was something I covered in my memoir, and I have been excited about for a number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I've only ever heard of epigenetics in one other instance. It was a book I read a year ago by Jamie Ford, and I thought it was really interesting. And it's definitely a concept I want to learn more about. I'll have to read your memoir and other books about it because it's really interesting.
Yes, so Jamie Ford's book is fabulous. The Many Daughters of Afong Moy.
Mhm.
And I only found it after I finished writing Orchid Child, and it blew me away because I had never read anything digging into it. And he kind of went a different direction. It included a little bit of speculative sci-fi like elements, which you wrote about in your review of his book, which is that as imagining that there might be someday an actual therapy created where a person is fed in some way, perhaps in some sort of invented, what do you call that? Fiction, surreal. Um, they have access to what actually happened to their ancestors. And so it's like a movie of,
Yeah.
reality fed to them. And that forms a kind of therapy. So that was, when I read that, I thought, my God, he really went for it. And because, who knows, that could happen someday.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, I'm really fascinated by the discussion of schizophrenia and mental disorders, the concept of second sight, and as we're discussing epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. What made you want to, I mean, you already mentioned it a little bit with your memoir, but what made you want to talk about these different concepts and also draw parallels between them the way you did in Orchid Child?
Yeah. Well, in my memoir, I talk about the fact that my oldest son had what was called a psychotic break. And he could have gone, if we hadn't arrested it, down the road to a schizophrenic kind of state. But that was just around the time that the psychiatric profession was realizing that when it's a teenager involved, you can actually treat it and halt the progression. And some of the doctors, and as the mother of such a child, I, frantically, unfortunately, I was already a science reporter. You get in there and you find out what's possible. And this was a very new approach. This was in the late 90s. And so the people who were researching what was possible with medication and therapy, which is the approach, they also looked at things like a psychosis spectrum. That, in fact, it turns out that a fair number of normal, not at all mentally ill or negatively affected people do see visions. There's an element of all of us that, hallucinations don't strictly belong to the mentally ill. And they also, occur particularly among young children, but then there's a small number, maybe under 5% or 3% of people who have hallucinations for their whole lives. And then there's a sort of spectrum where some of them, you would go so far as to say they're psychic. And then you go a little further in indigenous cultures where those kinds of people are called shamans and are honored for various, particularly because they perform a kind of service to the community. And, so through my own, first of all, my son had a full recovery, and that inspired me to include such a situation in my novel. And that's why the character of Teague is patterned after both my son and several other young people who I got to know who had been through this. And so I then, wanted to kind of include this kind of overview, this kind of macro view that, like, wait a minute, psychosis, which, we only have a negative view of in like our mainstream culture, that, and of course, if you do see things, you don't generally talk about it because you don't want to be called crazy. But if it were a little less stigmatized, I imagine we'd hear all kinds of things. It's sort of like the near-death experiences that we're starting to hear more about because more people are being brought back. And even, let's say, UFOs and that whole thing, it's like our conversations are starting to get more open.
Yeah, that's true. I love that we're seeing a lot of
Yes.
destigmatization of things and people being more open about discussing different things that were previously taboo or just misunderstood. And I think
Yeah.
I think the more we talk about it and see books about it, it's just better for everyone.
Yeah. So, as we were talking, there's, because Kate, the main character in Orchid Child, is a neuroscientist, and she goes to Ireland with her nephew Teague, who to take on a new job after she blows one in New York City. And she is there to look at a strange spike of schizophrenia that occurred historically in this one area of Ireland, not knowing that she's returned to her ancestral homeland because her grandparents in the story don't talk about why they ever left in the first place. So she does find that out. And then in the course of her and Teague being in this kind of place in West Ireland where actually William Butler Yates was once a resident of that same county, and he's known to have called it stubbornly enchanted. So there is a kind of way in which modernity coexists with things like fairies and fairy hills and druids. In fact, to this day, there are situations where highways get rerouted because some of the local residents don't want to mess what was traditionally known to be a fairy hill. And this actually happens not because everyone believes in fairies, but because they want to be on the safe side just in case.
Yeah.
So, and I had been there and met, and then there also are modern day druids practicing there. And So, having been there, I wanted to incorporate that level of local reality there and history, which is still present in the culture. So, in the story, Teague, who is in treatment for what could, progress to be either full-blown schizophrenia or, perhaps not, but Kate is being more on the medical side, assuming he is going to get worse and that he has a disease. Teague, meanwhile, meets druids, some modern day practicing druids, who see and hear his unusual perceptions, and they identify them as second sight, which is traditionally, a prophet or someone who sees the future and the past. And that, things happen where Teague then suddenly is reliving some of what his grandparents and others went through in the same town. And so past and present are kind of colliding. And so I was going to read a little bit where Kate, with her colleague, who is also her love interest eventually, Ryan, this is about midway through, and things have happened which are kind of undeniably strange and mystical, that Teague has seen things and heard things and done things. So Kate and Ryan are sitting together in a pub, actually. And so let me just pick up here. Okay, she says, I'll go there, eliciting a slight smile from Ryan. If second sight exists and Teague has it, what's the link between his gift and his worsening symptoms? Ryan nods, but instead of answering her, he studies his tented fingers. Ryan, when he looks up, there's a new vulnerability in his eyes. Your question leads to a larger mystery. He cocks his head to the side as if he's asking permission. Go ahead. With all the disadvantages schizophrenia conveys on the person who has it, including a lower reproductive rate and a higher rate of suicide, why has it held steady at 1% in our species since Homo erectus set out of Africa? Oh, don't tell me you're a closet evolutionary biologist. It's more of a sideline. All right, then, why hasn't schizophrenia gone the way of the woolly mammoth? She can't believe she just asked that question, but the sparkle in Ryan's eyes seems to be disarming her. The theory that makes the most sense to me allows for the possibility that these voices and visions held value for the affected person's community. What sort of value? Indigenous cultures had and still have shamans and medicine men whose visions are prophetic or healing for their tribes. These same figures are hiding in plain sight in Western traditions. Merlin was a druid who advised King Arthur on matters of war and marriage. Pliny and Julius Caesar wrote of druid priests who divined the right times for Celtic warriors to attack or retreat. We can walk 5 miles to Rathcrogan and stand on a Celtic sacred site. Wait, Kate says, are we discussing mental illness or religion? Neither. I'm talking about divergent minds who perceive things the rest of us don't. Ryan takes a breath. The Celts called it second sight. In our profession, we throw it all under the label of psychosis, or we assign patients different positions on a spectrum of abnormality. He stops talking and makes intense eye contact as if he's waiting for her response. The old Kate would have dismissed Ryan's line of thought as dangerous pseudoscience, but after 3 months in Ballymore, she's unable to do that. I admit it's intriguing, but I worry, aren't you getting close to romanticizing mental illness? I'm not saying every person with schizophrenia can turn on their higher perceptions at will and produce something of value. But if we want to know why it and other divergent mental states are still part of the human condition, we must consider the possibility that their unique perceptions have been adaptive at different points in history. Why not again?
That is such a wonderful passage that you chose. That was one of my favorite parts of the book. I remember marking it as such an interesting discussion.
Yeah, because it's sort of the heart of the matter. And I was concerned at various points that I was romanticizing mental illness, because, of course, there are some people for whom there is very little upside at all to having, what we would call an extreme neurodivergent state. But then there's all those in the middle, and, the people who really consider mysticism a normal part of their lives and want it to be okay to talk about and to share, part of the culture. Of course, the culture has a problem putting science and spirit in the same conversation or book anywhere. So obviously I threw that convention out the window here with Orchid Child.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit. One of
Yeah.
the things that I thought was interesting is the concept of being an orchid or a dandelion. That's not
Yeah.
something I heard of before reading this book. Can you talk about the difference between orchids and dandelions and why you included that as a central theme in this book?
Yeah, well, before when children are born with a vulnerability, which is all really you can say about mental illness and its initial stages, unless it's an extreme case, of course, but that it's a vulnerability. And now scientists have determined that there is a genetic variant that makes certain children just extremely sensitive to environmental influences, and that can be big trauma that happened to everyone, or it can just be kind of lousy parenting or neglect or actual abuse. And but when they have found through studying such children, and hundreds of them have been studied in here and in Sweden and other countries, that the very interesting thing is that, so you could say this is a genetic unlucky hand that these kids have been dealt. And so what they've determined is that the kids who had this vulnerability and who experienced not supportive upbringings, poor parenting, perhaps, they went down the bad roads that you would fear they would. They became, they had conduct disorders. They, developed full-blown mental disorders. But if those same children were given positive, supportive parenting, that they not only did okay, they did spectacularly well in many cases. In fact, they did better than those children who did not have this variant. And those, the term dandelion has been developed as a kind of opposite to the delicate orchid and the hardy dandelion. I identify as a dandelion. And so basically, we can handle pretty much anything and come out on top. I mean, not anything, but we're not as susceptible to things that happen around us or to us. Whereas, the orchid children, they can go either way. But the fact that they found this good news in this research was a complete shock to the scientists who were studying this. And the mystery of the fact that there was, in fact, a biological root to it all was a big breakthrough. So there have been a couple of really good books written about this. One I'll recommend to anyone who's interested is by Tom Boyce, who's a doctor and researcher who wrote the book called The Orchids and the Dandelions. And, so I identified Teague as a orchid child because, again, patterned after my own son and my experience with that situation where clearly he was vulnerable, and we kind of rescued him from a path that could have gone really badly. And so in that sense, kind of we made sure to, and also he identifies as neurodivergent, as Teague eventually does, and claims and feels empowered by that label. And so that's an orchid child.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I love that you included that. And I just really loved reading this book. I love that it was set in Ireland because I also, like you, have Irish ancestry, and my
Yeah.
sister actually lives in Ireland.
Oh,
And
great.
yeah, and so I loved that aspect of it. I loved the culture and the history that you brought in. I loved the characters, especially Teague. I thought he was so fascinating. Um, so we'll have to wrap up our interview soon, but before you go, I just want to ask one more question.
Sure.
Do you have plans to write more fiction in the future? And what can readers expect next from you?
Yeah, I actually, because it takes so long to finish and place a novel and get, there's plenty of like months at a time where you can, and so I was told the only way to stay sane during that part of the process is to start another novel. So I do have one that's, maybe a quarter of the way in. And I'll just tell you that the main character of that is a celebrity astrologer who has a kind of crisis of confidence because she misses some big things.
Yeah,
And so there's a kind of reckoning with what it means to be what she's being, and has become very wealthy, and a celebrity herself, sort of an Oprah style celebrity. So I thought that would be fun. And I had a friend who was that person. So I was inspired to try and tell that story. I think it'll be a lot lighter, actually, but more fun in many of the same ways, playing with what's real, like what's real and what's on the edge of reality.
that's amazing. I can't wait to read that one whenever it's available.
Okay, great.
Well, that is incredible. To anyone listening, you can get Orchid Child wherever books are sold right now. It's available as a paperback, ebook, and audiobook. Orchid Child is a fascinating novel and is absolutely worth reading, so definitely pick it up if you can. And thank you, Victoria. This has been a wonderful conversation, and it's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah, same here, Amanda.